presentation here on your screens. All right, so today we're going to be resuming our discussion and review of the muscles. I want to first start with any questions that you do have related to chapter 10 and the part that you were scheduled to watch from chapter 11. Any questions related to chapter 10, the skeletal muscles, or chapter 11, which is the nervous system? Any questions? Any questions here related to either the skeletal muscles covered in chapter 10 or the parts that you've watched last week related to the nervous system from chapter 11? How about the rest of you? Any questions? All right, so let's resume our discussion as part of the in-class activity questions. If you remember, we have been identifying those different muscles and reviewing together the action of each of them. So if you remember, with the last two questions, correct me if I'm wrong, were 22 and 23. Is this correct? For last week's in-class activity questions, the last two questions that we've discussed were 22 and 23. Is this correct? 32 and 33. Is this correct? I don't believe we started 34 yet. Yeah, gluteus maximus. Yes, exactly. So if you remember, what did we identify number 32? If you remember, this is a muscle located in the buttocks, and something related to the buttocks was gluteal. So we call it the gluteus. And we did have three muscles in the gluteal region. One of them was large, which is this one on here, the most superficial of them, number 33. It was the prime mover for, can you remind me, what was the action of the gluteus maximus, number 33 on here? Can you remind me what is the primary action of the gluteus maximus? If you remember, it's getting its origin here from the coxal bone and sacrum, and is inserted down here in the back of the femur. So it was pulling the thigh backwards, which increases the hip joint angle. So the primary movement that it performs was extension of the thigh at the hip joint. If you remember, number 32, what did we identify number 32? If you remember, this wasn't the smallest of them. This wasn't the gluteus minimus, but it was is the one located deeper, closer to the midline. So what did we identify number 32 as last meeting, if you remember? It's also a gluteal muscle located towards the midline. So what did we call it? It's mine, exactly, gluteus medius. And if you remember, the gluteus medius was getting its origin from the coxal bone, and it was inserted in the greater trochanter of the femur, on the outside of it at this point. So when it pulls the thigh, it's going to be pulling the thigh from this point and drag it to move towards the origin, towards the coxal bone. So the thigh itself is going to be moving away from the midline. So what did we call this movement? What is the primary action of the gluteus medius? If you can remind me, please. What do we call the movement when the thigh moves away from the midline? If I'm moving towards the midline, it's like adding. But if I'm moving away, I'm performing abduction. If I'm moving towards the midline, I am performing adduction. If I'm moving away, it's abduction. So here, gluteus medius is going to be doing what? It's going to be doing a movement of the thigh. It's going to allow the movement of the thigh away from the midline. In other words, it's going to be performing an abduction of the thigh. All right, so starting for today's in-class activity questions, today is the 19th. So please, when you write down in your in-class activity questions document, when you put today's date, we're going to be starting from number 34, not from question number 1 as what we're used to. All right, so starting today's in-class activity questions, we are starting from number 34 instead of starting from number 1 as what we're used to. All right, so this diagram is showing a group of muscles that we call the adductor muscle group. And what do all of those muscles share in common? They are inserted on the medial aspect of the femur at different locations, or even on the medial aspect of the tibia. And they all are getting the origin from the coxal bone, from the medial point on the coxal bone. If you remember from the video recording, how did we recall the names of those 4 muscles on here? Do you remember the mnemonics that we mentioned? Yeah, exactly, Cassandra. We mentioned to remember it's a gap between the thigh. This to remind us of the first letter of the muscles here forming the adductor muscle group. So if you remember, the most medial one, number 37, what did we call this medial muscle in the adductor muscle group that starts with a G? Exactly, this is my gracilis muscle. And then I have 2 adductors, they are called adductors. one that extends all the way to the back. It's a huge muscle. This is number 36. What do you think? What do we call this adductor muscle on here? Number 36. It's a large one, large one. This is my adductor magnus. Magnum is large. It's bulky, large. How about this one on here? That travels for a longer distance. So it is longer rather than bulkier. So what would we call number 35? Yeah, this one is my adductor longus. How about the small one here on the outside, the most lateral of the adductor muscle group, number 34? Yeah, it is my pectineus. If you remember, all of the four muscles, all of the four, gracilis, adductor magnus, adductor longus, and pectineus, all of them gonna be pulling the thigh to move towards the midline. So they all are allowing adduction of the thigh. All but one, pectineus, adductor longus, adductor magnus, all the three on here are also passing in front of the hip joint, as you notice on here. So they are adding force to the movement that allows you to pull the thigh towards your pelvis. So what do we call the movement in which I'm pulling the thigh towards the pelvis? Flexion of the thigh. So those three on here, pectineus, adductor longus, adductor magnus, all of them will have fibers passing in front of the hip joint, which will help with the flexion of the thigh. Any questions? Any question? Question? All right, so looking at our next diagram on here, you can see the four muscles which are located in the anterior compartment, forming the anterior compartment of the thigh. If you remember, number 42 here was a straight muscle running in the thigh. And it is the most superficial. Here on the right side, I have it. But on the left side, I've dissected the muscle to show you the fourth muscle located underneath it. So this one here, number 41, is hidden by 42. Can you notice the difference between the two sides? What is different between the right side and the left side? Can you see what I did in here? I removed this muscle to show you another muscle underneath. Can you see the difference? Yes or no? All right. So, four muscles located in the anterior compartment of the thigh. First, Let me start with 42 on here. What do you think we call the straight muscle of the thigh? The most superficial of them. What do we call straight muscle? Straight muscle. Rectus. Exactly. Rectus. And what do we call something related to the thigh? Yeah, it is femoris. If you remember, something related to the thigh is called femoral. So we're going to call this muscle, it's my rectus femoris. And I have three other muscles, three large muscles, if you notice. So a large muscle, we call it vast or vastus. Vast means large. So number 38, if you notice, it's the large muscle in the thigh, located where? You can see it's located close to the midline. So a large muscle located close to the midline. So what do we call it? What do you think? Vastus, large. And as I'm located on the medial side towards the midline, I call it medialis. And how about the muscle here? The large muscle located on the outside, away from the midline, on the lateral aspect of the thigh. What do you think we call this muscle? Number 39. Again, large muscle. So it's going to be vastus. And what do we call something on the outside or away from the midline? If the one towards the midline is medialis, we're going to call this one on here away from the midline. On the lateral side, it's my lateralis. So we're going to call this one, it's my vastus lateralis. About the large muscle located between the medialis, here on the medial side, and the lateralis. What do we call the one in the middle? It's still a large muscle, so we're still going to call it vastus. But it's not on the medial or lateral side, so what do we call something in between? Intermediate. So we're going to call it vastus intermedius. Yeah, we're missing number 40. Yes, we're missing number 40. Let me ask you as number 40, what is the action? Number 40, what is the action performed by the quadriceps? Femoris, which is simply all the four muscles combined. All the four of them combined action will be doing what? You see on here, all of them get inserted by a single tendon into my tibial tuberosity. So if I'm looking at a side view of the knee joint, this is my thigh, this is my knee like this is my leg. And I'm telling you that those muscles get inserted in here, in the tibial tuberosity. and they are coming down all the way like this. So when I pull the tibial tuberosity towards the origin, what's going to be the movements that I will be performing? I will be pulling the leg forwards like this. This means I will be increasing the angle of the knee joint. And if you remember, if I'm performing a movement, an angular movement along the sagittal plane, and this movement is causing the increase in the angle of the joint, this gonna mean for me I'm performing an extension. So this muscle, the primary action of it is gonna be extension exactly of the leg at the knee joint. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? All right, great, great. So let's move on to the hamstring muscles, which is a group of muscles located in the dorsal aspect of the thigh. So you see a muscle with two heads located on the lateral side of the thigh, of the posterior compartment of the thigh, and two muscles. One is superficial, number 43 is superficial, and one is deeper to it, number 44. So what do we call the two muscles on here, on the medial aspect of the posterior compartment of the thigh? Let's start with the superficial one, and as I see, it has a long tendon. Almost half of the length of the muscle is a tendon. So what did we call this muscle on here? Can you remind me, please? The superficial muscle located on the medial aspect of the posterior compartment of the thigh. What do we call this muscle on here? That half of its length is a tendon, and we use this fact to name the muscle. If you remember, what did we call it? Yeah, exactly. This is semi-half tendon. We're gonna call it semitendinosus. And located deeper to it, we're gonna see a muscle here that is flattened, like a membrane. So what would we call this muscle on here? Number 44. It's a flattened muscle that looks like a membrane. So we're gonna call it what? How about the rest of you? Yeah, it's gonna be my semimembranosus. How about the muscle with two heads? Here, number 45, located on the lateral aspect of the posterior compartment of the thigh. What do we call this muscle? Yeah, with two heads, so we're gonna call it biceps. And related to the thigh, so what do we call it? Something related to the thigh is femoral, so we're gonna call this is my biceps femoris. Biceps femoris. What's gonna be the action of all the three of them. If you notice on here, they all travel behind the hip joint. Traveling behind the hip joint, what action would they be performing? They would pull the thigh backwards. So they are helping the gluteus maximus to perform extension of the thigh at the hip joint. And if you notice, all of them are traveling posterior to the knee joint. So they would be pulling the leg to move backwards. What do we call the backward movement of the leg? It's a flexion. So they allow flexion of the leg at the knee joint. All of the three of them are going to help with extension of the thigh at the hip and flexion of the leg at the knee joint. Question? All right, so let's move on to our next muscle. You see on here, this is the longest muscle in the body. What do we call this muscle? It gets its origin, as you see on here, from the anterior superior iliac spine, from this point on of the iliac bone, and travels down. While it travels down, it travels medially and will be passing behind the knee and gets inserted in the medial aspect of the tibia. So what do we call this muscle? Exactly, this is my sartorius. And if you remember, the sartorius, or as you see on here, the sartorius is traveling in front of the hip joint. So if it travels in front of the hip joint, can you remind me what action would it help with? It's going to be dragging the thigh to move forwards. So what action, what do we call this action on here? If the sartorius is traveling in front of the hip joint, what action it's going to help with? Yeah, exactly. Flexion of the thigh at the hip. And as you see, it's traveling posterior to the knee joint. So it's going to be pulling the leg to move backwards. So what action will it be performing? So it pulls the thigh forwards, but it pulls the leg backwards. What action would I be performing on here? On the leg? Also flexion. It's also gonna allow flexion. So this is gonna be the only muscle that performs the same action on both hip and knee. Performs flexion of both hip joint and the knee joint. So you see on here, it allows the flexion of the leg and the knee. Also, as you see, I'm inserted on the medial side and I'm getting it my origin from the lateral side. So when I pull the medial aspect of the leg towards the lateral aspect of the thigh, what's going to happen? I'm performing a rotation of the thigh towards the outside. So another action of the sartorius is going to be to perform lateral rotation of the thigh. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? All right, so looking at number 47 and 48, and those are the two muscles located in the anterior compartment of the leg. If you notice on here, number 48 is superficial. I kept it on this side, but I've removed it from the other side. It doesn't exist on here. What do we call the superficial muscle with a single tendon, if you notice on here, located in the anterior compartment of the leg? Number 48. What do you think? What is the bone? What is a large bone on here? You remember? Tibia. So what do we call the muscle, the most prominent muscle attached to it? We're gonna call it tibialis. So this is gonna be my tibialis anterior. And this one on here, it has 4 tendons going to the lateral foretoes. It's located on the anterior compartment of the leg, just underneath the tibialis anterior. What do we call this muscle on? Extensor digitorum. I'm performing a dorsiflexion which corresponds to an extension. So it's going to be considered an extensor. So it's going to be an extensor digitorum. But remember, we've seen another extensor digitorum in the forearm. So in order for us to differentiate between the two, we will consider the relative difference in length between the two muscles to name them. So this one, because it's longer, so we're going to call it extensor digitorum longus. So tibialis anterior is going to be pulling the foot up like this, performing dorsiflexion. If you remember, we don't call it extension, although it is an extension movement, but we don't call it extension, we call it dorsiflexion of the foot. The extensor digitorum longus is going to be pulling the toes, the lateral 4 toes, upwards like this. So this will help what movement? Again, dorsiflexion. But this time it's dorsiflexion of the lateral 4 toes. You remember here, the posterior compartment of the leg, they have a deep muscle and the superficial muscle. What did we call this deep muscle on here? Number 49. What do you think? How about the rest of you? What do you think? It's got two muscles. One is much larger and more, and it's going to be superficial, and one is flattened and deep. Okay, it's underneath. They both share a common tendon here that gets inserted down in the calcaneus, the bone of the heel. What do we call this muscle, number 49? Can you remind me, please? Yes, exactly. This is my soleus. And what do we call this large muscle located superficial to it? What do you think? Yeah, exactly. This is my gastrocnemius. And do you remember what do we call this tendon here? That both of them gonna use to be inserted in the calcaneus. This is the tendon of the calcaneus. So what do we call this tendon on here? Anyone else? Yeah, calcaneal tendon or Achilles tendon. Achilles because of the Greek mythology story that you all know about. Alright, this is my calcaneal or Achilles tendon. All right, so what is the what is going to be the common action here for the soleus and gastrocnemius? If you notice on here, they both are inserted in the calcaneus. So when I pull the calcaneus upwards, this will drive the foot to move downwards towards the ground. So what do we call this downward movement of the foot? It is a plantar, exactly, plantar flexion. All right. So I want to go over all the muscles here in this review one last time very quickly, and please stop me if you do have any question. So the very first muscle that you see was located above the cranium, above the cranial bones. So we call it the epicranius. The epicranius did have an anterior belly and a posterior belly connected in between by a flattened tendon. We call this flattened tendon is my gala aponeurotic. The anterior belly of the epicranius, this was located in the front or the anterior aspect of the head. So we called it the frontalis muscle. The posterior one was located in the back of the head. That's why we called it the occipitalis muscle. If you remember, the frontalis muscle gets its origin from the gala aponeurotica and gets inserted in the skin of the forehead. The action here was to pull your eyebrows up, elevation of the eyebrows, and it wrinkles the skin of your forehead. Another muscle that you seen was a muscle that gets its origin, as you see on here, from the zygomatic arch, which includes the zygomatic bone and process, and gets inserted down here in the angle of the mandible. We call this is my masseter. The masseter is going to be pulling the mandible upwards, allowing elevation of the mandible, and this is a movement required in the chewing process. So it's one of the strongest mastication muscles. Looking on here, number 4, this was a flattened muscle that gets its origin from the first ribs as well as the clavicle and partly from the sternum, travels upwards to be inserted in the lower margin of the mandible. This was my platysma. And if you remember, the platysma helps a little bit with the depression of the mandible, although you don't need a muscle to allow the depression of the mandible because it moves down by the effect of the gravity. So that's why you don't need a bulky muscle on here. It performs a very minimal effort. But another action that we're going to be performing by the platysma is that it stretches the skin of the neck, and this will be a feature of expressing horror and fright. Another muscle that you seen was a circular muscle located around the eye. This is my orbicularis oculi. And if you remember, when you contract a circular muscle, you are reducing its diameter. So when I reduce the diameter of the muscles, this will allow me to close my eye, which is needed here also for blinking. A muscle that we've seen getting its origin from the zygomatic arch to be inserted in the angle of the mouth. This is my zygomaticus. Remember, we do have a zygomaticus major and a zygomaticus minor, but we do not differentiate between them for the sake of the exam. So keep it just zygomaticus. If you notice, the muscle on here is going to be pulling the insertion towards the origin, or in other words, it's going to be pulling the angle of the mouth upwards, allowing you to smile. So this is the smiling muscle here. Zygomaticus. A circular muscle that you've seen, which was located around the oral orifice or the opening of the mouth. This is my orbicularis oris. And the action, as we've learned, is that a circular muscle, when it contracts, is going to be reducing its diameter. So when I reduce the diameter of this circular muscle, the orbicularis oris, what I will be doing is a closure of the oral orifice, the opening of the mouth. This is one thing. The other thing is that you're going to be pursing your lips. That's why we call this as the kissing muscle. A muscle that is getting its origin from the maxillary bone to be inserted in the mandible, located in the side of your cheek. This is the buccinator muscle or buccinator muscle. If you remember, the buccinator muscle or the buccinator muscle was responsible to compress the food rather than accumulating on the side of your oral cavity in your cheeks. So it compresses the food to not accumulate in your cheeks. And this helps with the chewing process. A muscle that we've seen in the neck was getting its origin from the manubrium of the sternum, from the medial 1/3 of the clavicle, which fiber is going to be traveling upwards to be inserted in the mastoid process of the temporal bone. When I contract just one side, the head is going to be rotating because I'm pulling this mastoid process, let's say, towards the midline of the body. So the head itself is going to be rotating. If I am contracting the two sides and simultaneously in the same time, I'm pulling both mastoid processes downwards towards my chest. So it allows flexion of the neck. What do we call this muscle that gets its origin from sternum, clavicle, and gets inserted in the mastoid process? We call it the sternocleidomastoid. Looking here at a muscle that gets its origin from above the spine of the scapula. This is my supraspinatus. Another that gets its origin from below the spine of the scapula. This is my infraspinatus, and a cylindrical shaped small muscle on here. This is my teres minor, and I've got a large one that you don't have on the list. This is the teres major. All those muscles and another one located from the other side, called the subscapularis, are helping the stabilization of the shoulder joint, preventing its dislocation as they act as extracapsular reinforcement, if you remember back from the joints chapter. We did see also a triangular shaped muscle that gets its origin from the lateral one third of the clavicle, the acromion, and the spine of the scapula for it to be inserted on the lateral aspect of the humerus. This is my deltoid muscle. If you remember, the deltoid muscle is the one that performs most of the effort to pull the arm away from the body. In other words, it allows abduction of the arm at the shoulder joint. Looking down in the back, we can see here a large muscle that gets its origin from the lower thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, vertebrae, coccyx bone, I'm sorry, coxal bone, and the muscle fibers are going to be traveling up and forward to be inserted in the anterior aspect of the humerus. This is my latissimus dorsi. So latissimus dorsi is going to be allowing rotation of the arm, but it mainly here, it is the main muscle to pull the arm backwards. It's the main muscle to perform arm extension. Looking here in the chest, we've seen a large muscle in the pectoral region. We call it the pectoralis major. As you see, it gets its origin from the medial one third of the clavicle, manubrium, body of the sternum, and the costal cartilages on here for the muscle fibers to converge and to be inserted in the anterior aspect of the humerus. The pectoralis major going to be pulling the arm to move towards the body, to move towards the midline. So it allows adduction of the arm. At the same time, it's going to be pulling the arm forwards, allowing the flexion of the arm and the shoulder. Looking here on the ventral aspect of the scapula, between the scapula and the chest, we can see a muscle located underneath the scapula. What do we call this muscle located underneath the scapula? If you remember, this is my subscapularis. Subscapularis. Looking here at a muscle with three heads located in the posterior compartment of the arm. This is my triceps brachii. If you remember, it has a long head, a lateral head, and a medial head. Long head only gets its origin from the scapula. The other two heads are getting their origin from the shaft of the humerus. All the three heads will be inserted in the olecranon process of the ulna. When I pull the olecranon process backwards, this will allow me to perform extension of the forearm at the elbow. Looking at the muscles of the forearm, if you remember, we did have to ask three questions here to be able to identify the muscle, whether I am looking at the anterior compartment or the posterior compartment of the forearm. And I told you I rely on finding the olecranon process for me to be able to differentiate between anterior and posterior aspects. When I see olecranon process of the ulna, this tells me that I'm looking at the posterior aspect of the forearm. And this will allow me to tell whether the muscle I'm looking at is a flexor or an extensor. If I'm located on in the anterior compartment, it's going to be a flexor. If it's located in the posterior compartment, it's going to be an extensor. The second question I need to ask myself is whether the muscle has one tendon or four tendons. If the muscle has a single tendon, so it's going to be mainly performing an action affecting my wrist joint. And if I'm only affecting the wrist joint, something related to the wrist, it's going to be carpi. What if I have 4 tendons? So 4 tendons means I'm going to be moving the fingers rather than the wrist only. So if I am moving the fingers, something related to the fingers, it's digitorum. Digitorum. The third question is to check whether the tendon is going towards the thumb or in the opposite direction. If it's going toward the thumb, this means for me it's going laterally, so it's going to be on the same side as the radius, so we call it radialis. Or if the tendon is going to the opposite direction from the thumb, or in other words, the medial side, we're going to call it ulnaris. So applying those 3 questions on here, what can we see? It's going to be a muscle located in the posterior compartment of the forearm, so it's an extensor. It has only 1 tendon, so it only affects the wrist joint, so it's carpi. And its tendon is going towards the thumb, so it's going to be radialis. But we've seen that there is another muscle that will share the same exact characteristics. So in order for us to differentiate between the two, we call this one extensor carpi radialis longus, and we call the other one it's extensor carpi radialis brevis. You can see on here number 22, it was a muscle located in the posterior aspect, so it's an extensor. It has a single tendon, carpi, and its tendon is traveling away from the thumb, so it's going to be ulnaris. Looking here, still posterior compartment, a muscle with 4 tendons, so it's going to be an extensor, and it affects the lateral 4 fingers. It's going to be digitorum. Here I don't see the olecranon long process, so it is the anterior compartment of the forearm. So this muscle has to be a flexor. It is a flexor, and when I checked here, it has a single tendon, so it only affects the wrist joint, so it's going to be carpi. So this is my flexor carpi, and I see that the tendon is traveling towards the thumb, or in other words, to the lateral side. So we're going to call it flexor carpi radialis. Is there any difficulty here? Any question? Any question? All right, so moving on, you see a muscle with 2 heads, a long head, short head, located in the anterior compartment of the arm. This is my biceps brachia. Both origins are coming from the scapula, and this insertion is going to be in the radial tuberosity of the waist. The biceps brachii is a prime mover for forearm flexion and also allows pronation. Looking at the muscles in the abdominal wall, you can see a oblique muscle located on the outside. This is my external oblique. When I dissected it, what I see underneath it is a straight muscle traveling in the abdomen, so we're going to call it rectus abdominis, and another oblique muscle which fibers are traveling in the opposite direction to the first one. So we're going to call it an oblique muscle, but this one is located deeper, so we're going to call it the internal oblique. I know that the internal oblique is not on the list, so don't expect it to be on your exam, but you do have one other that is not under this review, which is the transversus abdominis. So please check this out. The two recti muscles are going to be attached to a tendon that travels connecting the xiphoid process to the symphysis pubis. This tendon looks like a white line. That's why we call it linea alba. Looking here at a large muscle in the gluteal region, this is my gluteus maximus. You're gonna be pulling the thigh backwards, allowing extension of the thigh as a hip joint. Underneath it, we're gonna see a relatively large muscle located deeper to it. So we called it the gluteus medius, which is inserted in the greater trochanter of the femur. Pulling the greater trochanter from outside will allow me to move my thigh away from the midline, or in other words, perform abduction of the thigh at the hip. Four muscles that are forming the adductor muscle group. In order for us to remember the names on here, we use the mnemonic GAP. Remember, when we are using the mnemonic, we start from the most medial muscle going laterally. So the first medial muscle is the gracilis. Then I have a huge bulky muscle on here. This is the adductor magnus. Following it is going to be the adductor longus, and finally the pectineus. All of them are pulling the thigh towards the midline, allowing adduction of the thigh. Pectineus, adductor longus, and magnus are traveling in front of the hip joint, so they help with the flexion of the thigh at the hip. Looking at the four muscles that will be forming the anterior compartment of the thigh, those are my quadriceps femoris. The most superficial of them is the rectus femoris. A large muscle located on the medial aspect, this is going to be vastus medialis. Another one on the lateral aspect of the thigh, this is going to be vastus lateralis. And located between the vastus lateralis and medialis, this is going to be my vastus intermedius. All the four muscles, as you see, will have a common tendon that will be inserted in the tibial tuberosity. All the four muscles going to help with the extension of the leg and the knee joint. Rectus femoris is the only one that helps with the flexion of the thigh because it is the only one that travels in front of the hip joint. All the other vasti here are getting their origin from the femur itself, so they don't travel in front of the hip joint. Looking on here at the hamstring group, you see a muscle with two heads located on the lateral side of the posterior compartment of the thigh. This is my biceps femoris. On the medial side, we have two muscles. One, the superficial one of them, half of its length, it's a tendon, so we call it semitendinosus. Underneath the semitendinosus, we have a flattened muscle that looks like a membrane, so we call it semimembranosus. All the three muscles are here going to help with extension of the hip and flexion of the knee. Longest muscle in the body, this is my sartorius. If you remember, the sartorius travels in front of the hip and behind the knee joints, which will allow it to perform flexion of the hip and flexion of the knee, also lateral rotation of the thigh. The anterior compartment of the leg, we've seen two muscles, one with a single tendon. This is my tibialis anterior, and another one with four tendons, which is my extensor digitorum longus. In the posterior compartment, we did need to be able to identify two muscles, which are the gastrocnemius, which is located superficial in the posterior compartment of the leg, and the deeper one, which is flattened. This is my soleus. Both of them gonna fuse together to be inserted in the calcaneus by the calcaneal tendon or the Achilles tendon. Any question? Any question? So looking at this review and studying and become familiar with all the muscles, actions, origins, and insertions that have been listed on your muscles list, this gives you a very good idea about what to expect on the exam. But just remember that this review is missing two muscles that you do have on the list, but are not included in this review, and those are the transversus abdominis and the trapezius. Those are the only two muscles that you do have on the list which haven't been included in this review. All right, so I want to give you an assignment for us to review together next meeting. So it's going to be based on what you've watched in chapter 11. Again, this is an assignment that we're going to review together next meeting. It's an essay question here. Please describe in your essay. You still need to add it to the in-class activity question. Done. Please describe the ionic changes taking place during the various phases of an action potential. All right, so again, it's an assignment here that you're gonna add to your in-class activity questions document, and we're gonna be discussing this in more details next meeting. But for now, just to get you started, Can you remind me of the very different phases of an action potential? Just to get you started. What are the different phases of an action potential? What is the very first phase that a muscle or a nerve cell going to be passing through to allow the formation of an action potential? Remember, this is how an action potential looks like when I draw it on a graph, detecting the electronic changes. So we started by phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. What did we call the very first phase of an action potential before I start the depolarization? Before I start the depolarization, yeah, this is my resting membrane potential. Once I get a stimulus, if you remember what's a stimulus, it is a change in the environment. What's going to happen? How is a muscle cell or a nerve cell going to be responding? It opens ion channels, allowing the second phase to take place. What did we call the second phase of the action potential? Which the cell membrane becomes more positively charged, going up. What did we call this phase of the action potential number 2? What do you think? I've lost my resting membrane polarity, so we call it depolarization. So I did depolarize, I conducted the message, and now I want to be ready to conduct another message, so I need to return back to my resting membrane polarity. What do we call this phase during which the muscle or nerve cell returns back to the initial membrane polarity? What is the third phase of the action potential? Anybody did watch the videos for chapter 11? Did anyone watch the videos for chapter 11? Yes? All right, so can you remind me, please, what do we call the phase during which you return back to the resting membrane polarity, the action potential? You return. What do we call this? Yeah, repolarization. And if you remember, the ions that I will rely on to get a repolarization done will be leaked out even after I reach my resting membrane potential, which will create an extra polarization. I will even become more polarized than my initial state. What did we call this phase of the action potential? What do you think? This is my hyperpolarization. All right, this is a long essay question. So I want you to mention all the details that are taking place in terms of ion movements in all those four phases. This is about a page and a half or 2 pages long essay question that I'm expecting from you. All right, we're going to discuss the details of those phases next week in our meeting. Is this clear for everybody? Is this clear? Yeah, 1.5 to 2 pages, yes. Do you have any questions for me? All right, so this is pretty much everything I wanted to discuss with you today. Thank you so much for making it to the meeting. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you all next week. So this will be due with the questions we are submitting. Yes, so it's going to be part of your in-class activity participation. Yes, exactly. All right, so please don't forget